Vince Lee, welcome to Tech Talk with Daniel Albu.
Glad to be here. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's truly an honor to have you here today, as you and the technologies you've worked on not only brought some of my favorite LucasArts titles to life, but also revolutionized the industry. You may not know that, but your former colleagues and people in general often describe you as a genius programmer. So this begs the question, how did you get into programming?
Well, that's really kind of interesting. It's kind of like, and this is obviously dating me, but I guess, that kind of, it's kind of the same for everybody you've been talking to, is, when I was a kid, my dad actually built a computer from a kit. It was an H89, a Heathkit computer. And that was like the first computer that we had. And I remember like being a kid and going to I think it was the West Coast Computer Show in San Francisco, and going out there and seeing all the, original 8-bit computers. And so it just kind of started out as a hobby there with our first computer. If I was going to go back, I'd probably say my first introduction to computers in general was at the Lawrence Hall of Science. And that was back when they had those, teletype computers, and you could play Lunar Lander or Star Trek on them. And that was a big deal to be able to do that. So later on, having a computer at home and actually having a screen where you could actually do, rough character graphics was just amazing. We had a very low bar at the time.
And what exactly captivated you about these games about Star Trek and Lunar Lander?
Well, it was kind of like, I was always I loved arcade games. I didn't always spend that much time in them, but being able to kind of like have something similar to an arcade experience at home, and then later on just programming my own little versions of arcade games was really fun. Like I did a version of Space War and character graphics on the H89, and in 8080 assembly language. That was one of the things I did when I was, I don't know, probably like 15, and that kind of got me into the world of programming and later on games.
And what was it like watching your father build the Heathkit H89 from scratch? And did you help him in any way? Did you get any hands-on experience from him building
This is something he was doing as part of this kind of like, it was a Heathkit like electronics course. So he did it late at night when I was like already in bed and stuff. And it was like, I don't know, I think it was kind of like they had pre-built circuit boards and you just kind of like populated all the individual components onto it. But, I did learn to solder as a kid and, started my own projects not too long after that.
And not too long after that, you also learned to program in BASIC. What was the first game you programmed in BASIC?
All right. The first game I did in BASIC was probably, I was in 7th grade, and my older brother had access to the computer room at, that was in, I think it was like in the math class, and it was in this closet in the math class. And it was an old TRS-80 level 1. And it was like, I remember like everything was done at this DOS prompt. It wasn't DOS, it was their own kind of operating system, right? And I remember the operating system was so basic, even the error messages were what or how, And so the first game I programmed there was actually like a version of like a Snake game, again, in character graphics in BASIC.
Wow. And at 15, you sold your first game. What can you tell me about the game itself, what the game was about, and how did it feel to break into the industry at such a young age?
I sold a game to the H89 users group. And it was done in assembly language, character graphics, and it was a version of Berserk, really. A copy, again, of arcade games, which is what I tended to do. And, I got a couple $100 for it.
What was the retail price?
I don't remember. In fact, I think they overpaid me. I think they paid me for the number of copies they produced rather than the ones they sold, because I think it was like $5 a copy or something. So
that's why they changed the contracts from that point on, because they learned from their mistakes. Maybe paying the programmer per copy is supposed to be per copy sold.
Yeah, I think it was actually an honest mistake, because I think they later said, "Oh, we mispaid you, so we'll just credit you and like we'll take it out of future earnings." At that point, other computers were taking off. The H89 was a very niche market even from the beginning. So I think I probably still owe, this organization. I'm sure it doesn't exist, but if I did, I still would owe them like $200.
Maybe you rent them into the ground because you owed them too much.
Yeah, that's my fault. I just, laid them to waste.
So when did you start working at LucasArts?
I went to LucasArts right out of grad school. So I think it was spring of 1991. Mm-hmm. And I didn't get my degree in computer science. I got it in mechanical engineering with an emphasis on robotics and control systems. But like I'd been doing computers on the side as an Amiga programmer, both personally and just also as I picked up all this contract work on the side, doing it for various companies. And, when I got out into the job market, the mechanical engineering jobs are just boring. I interviewed at IBM. I interviewed at Exxon Production Research in Houston. I interviewed with Boeing. Yeah, both because I didn't take that. At Boeing was like amazing at the time because you go up there and you're in this giant hangar and then there's like a big grid of cubicles and it laid out in 10 by 10. I think it was like 10 by 10 and each cubicle had like a row and a column and that's how everybody was organized. You didn't have a number, you had a column and a row. And then everybody has white shirts and ties. And I said, this isn't for me. I had some friends who had worked at LucasArts. They had contacted me like the summer before wanting me to do some work on some game. But I decided to go to Europe instead. So when I graduated, I was visiting a friend up at the ranch and I just passed off my resume and that led to an interview and they gave me an offer and it was a lot less than the mechanical engineering jobs. But I looked around, I looked at the people and I thought, I just something in my gut just said, go for this. You're going to enjoy this a lot more than going out as an industry as a junior mechanical engineer.
Well, you're right. So what was the interview process like at LucasArts?
It was really informal. I remember like being at Eric Wilmotter's desk, showing him some of the products I worked on. I had sold I had done some work for another company and sold like this little music product. And I also had this game on the side that I'd done for another company. Both of those really didn't sell anything, but they were commercially released. And so I remember kind of showing him that. And I don't remember much more beyond that. I didn't realize, I remember that like, because it was a games company, he was more interested in the game than in the like music product. And sometimes it was kind of like, well, anyway, I don't remember much more beyond that, but it was a pretty low-key interview process. And Brad Taylor, I remember, was there too.
Wow. As an employee, or was he just at SCAMU at that time?
Oh, well, I was, Brad was, basically I was hired into the tools group, which is basically working with Brad under Eric. So we were responsible for working on the SCUM engine, and specifically I was hired originally to work on the Amiga part of that, the Amiga side, as the Amiga programmer.
And what was your first day at LucasArts like?
I remember my first day at LucasArts, they had a product that was for Monkey Island Amiga, and it was behind schedule. It had an intermittent crash, and the previous programmer hadn't been able to figure out what it was. And they'd been sitting on it for like 3 months trying to get the thing shipped. And so my first day was, here's an emergency. Can you figure out, what's wrong with this? We need to get this out the door. And the immediate thing I noticed, I happened to know at the back of my head, I knew this little hint. And the way that like Monkey Island worked and the rest of the SCUM games worked is basically it would allocate all the memory in the system, right? And then use that and do its own memory management from that pool. But the Amiga was a little bit different because at the time, as opposed to like all the other platforms, the Amiga had a multitasking operating system. So even when you were running your game, there's the potentially other background processes that are also using resources. So stealing all the memory up front, is really unfriendly in a multitasking operating system, right? And so I knew there was one little trick, which was the original console window, which was called the CLI on the Amiga. I can't believe I remember that. That you could sit there and close the CLI window, as you spawn your application, And that means all the resources in the CLI window go away, but also there isn't this background task potentially trying to ask for resources. Happen to know that off the top of my head. Added the one line change to the batch file to launch the app. They tested it. It stopped crashing.
So this was your first day? On your first day, you fixed this bug?
I think so. It was at least the first week. It might have been the first day.
Wow, still impressive. Well done. And this was also your first credit. You were credited for the conversion. So apart from fixing the bug, did you do anything else in the conversion itself?
The thing was all done. The only thing I did was, besides that I was really proud of, only from an Amiga point of view, is I convinced them to change the palette. Because the original port was using the CGA palette. So you're thinking about all the extreme, the cyans and the magentas. And I convinced them to tweak the palette because it is Amiga. And that's what always bugged me when I played the LucasArts games is it's like, why are they using CGA colors? You can actually have a flesh tone for your skin. You don't have to use, magenta for it. And so I convinced them to just change the palette, and then they changed some of the background art, some places where, they needed to replace the they wanted something like more purplish. And so they remapped some of the backgrounds. But, that was my little contribution to that product. It was pretty much done at that time.
So did you work on the color palette conversions as well, or was it just your idea?
It was just my idea to do that, and I just kind of talked them into it. I think I might have played around with some of the palettes as a suggestion, to saying, "Hey, look, this character works a lot better if you could do something with this palette instead."
And still in 1991, you were also credited for Monkey Island 2, LeChuck's Revenge, where you worked on the SCUM system. Mm-hmm. What were your specific contributions to the SCUM system in this game?
I think my biggest contribution, I think, which most people wouldn't really know, is to Fate of Atlantis. I believe it was Fate of Atlantis. And the Fate of Atlantis was really, really interesting because I actually used some of the Amiga special hardware capabilities to actually change the palette on the fly on a scan line between the interface and the you have the interface down below, and then you have the upper section where you have the window where you're walking your character around. And on Fate of Atlantis, there are actually two separate palettes, because it's changing it on the fly. So, as the processor, I think it was called the copper at the time, as it's generating the scan lines, you can actually insert instructions to change the palette. And it takes like a scan line or two to do that. And so if you look at like Fate of Atlantis, you'll see that the interface has a consistent color palette, whereas the upper screen changes palettes. So rather than like having one palette through the whole game, like CGA palette, that was in Monkey Island, Fate of Atlantis, every upper screen has its own palette, and then there's a separate palette that's consistent for the interface below.
Wow! And did you assist in any way with color cycling capabilities?
My contribution was largely on the tool side. So I was in the tools group. So I worked with Brad on working on the graphics tools. Like he had built like a tool called Decay, which was a product that could take 256 color images and let you kind of bring it down to a smaller palette to be used on the Amiga and other platforms. So I worked on different algorithms for that. And then later I wrote, we were using D-Paint, Deluxe Paint inside the company for graphics. And I made a program called V-Paint, which was basically my version of D-Paint, but in high res and with animation capabilities. So you could do frame-by-frame animations and preview.
Wow. So in 1992, you were credited for SCUM programming, Macintosh music, and Macintosh sounds on the Macintosh version of The Secret of Monkey Island. What exactly had to be done to convert the music and sounds to be compatible with the Mac? And what were the technical challenges in this conversion process?
I'm not actually sure what that actually credit is referring to. So, I mean, I had worked on, I had basically done some work integrating iMuse, and I'd also written an audio editor. I don't know if it responds to that, but basically I'd written an in-house tool that I later used a lot for Rebel Assault, which is for editing audio files. Because Rebel Assault was prior to Rebel Assault, all of our sound was it was through they were just basically MIDI files. So they would play through either a software synthesizer, either through a Roland sound card through MIDI, or through iMuse had its own kind of software synthesis where it would play through your Sound Blaster, and we would have recorded sound samples that kind of simulated the Roland, etc. And Rebel Assault was the first product we did that actually did streaming sound, where we actually recorded. I actually, recorded off the CDs with my Amiga, the John Williams soundtrack CDs, and then played those samples back in Rebel Assault for digital sound. And so the tool, I wrote the tool to edit those sounds, to go ahead and cut pieces together, crossfade them together, and to build the actual, background score that would fit whatever, especially for Rebel Assault 2, to fit whatever scenes that we wanted to show.
So you don't know why you were credited for Mac Sounds and Mac Music?
I don't know what that actually refers to.
Very well. In 1993, you were credited for the Sega CD conversion of The Secret of Monkey Island.
Yes.
What can you share about this conversion of the game?
I did do the Sega CD conversion of it. The Sega CD, as I recall, was like a 68,000 processor, so it was pretty similar to the Amiga. The hardware, the display hardware was very, very complex, though, because the display hardware wasn't bitmap based; it was tile based, and it didn't actually have enough memory to actually build a whole screen full of unique tiles. So I wrote a system that would actually do an off-screen bitmap and convert the tiles on the fly, and it would look for duplicate tiles to so it could do enough reuse so that it could actually stay within budget and actually display on the Sega CD. And the Sega CD was really weird hardware too, because it was kind of like you had your normal Sega unit, and then the CD plugin came in with additional memory in addition to the CD drive. It also had a different memory block. But the memory block, I believe, was like you would page it in and out by poking at a register on the 68,000 side.
Right, I can't think of a single scene in The Secret of Monkey Island where you have any duplicate tiles, because every background is vastly different from the other, and you have scrolling screens, and so nothing stays put, especially when you're scrolling the screen. So how exactly did you find duplicate tiles anywhere in the game?
They're most of the time your duplicate tiles are basically your blank areas of color. So if you have common texture or your common, and if it's just a solid color, that's the most likely place, if I recall correctly, that there would be duplicates.
Maybe the lower part of the screen with the verbs, that's the only duplicate tiles you get between frames.
Yeah, what I remember doing is writing the engine, testing it out, and then playing parts of the game. And then sometimes when it run out of tiles, you'd see glitches. And then we have to figure out, it's like, oh, maybe we can, blank out the sky at this part or stuff to make more duplicates and stuff in the background to make it work better.
Awesome. Still in 1993, you were credited for the Scum system on Day of the Tentacle and 7 Max Hit the Road. Now, these games, along with the CD version of Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, were LucasArts' first talkie games. Did you have any involvement in the addition of voice capabilities to the Scum system?
Not that I recall. At that point, I was kind of like, my main contribution, kind of some of the later games, was basically when I started integrating the Insane Engine and different versions of the Insane Engine from Rebel Assault, like in Full Throttle and stuff, to actually play cutscenes or for Outlaws.
Now, you also worked on the Amiga version of Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, and while you were working on that, they asked you to work on your own CD-ROM project. How did that meeting go, and what were their expectations from this project?
Yeah, let me kind of give you a little bit of, because it's kind of interesting. Like in hindsight, people think, oh, it's this big project, but Star Wars Rebel Assault, what was then like Star Wars CD-ROM, was a project that nobody cared about. nobody wanted to do it, which is why it actually fell onto my plate. And it was really kind of started, I think it was at the Consumer Electronics Show, like late one night, in kind of a situation with a lot of drinking. I think Kelly Flock kind of came up with the idea saying, "Oh, Vince, I want you to go ahead and lead this project." And I don't even know what it was, right? And the thing about it is, Rebel Assault at the time, before it was called Rebel Assault, was something we were just contractually obligated to do. The previous president had signed a deal with JVC, who wanted to create some kind of product to sell on the FM Towns and the Sega CD, right? So JVC, this was before LucasArts, before we published our own apps, and we went through JVC as a publisher. And so what had happened is the company had taken some development money up front to go ahead and build this game with really no spec on what it was, other than you're flying over land, and the inspiration was based on a demo that Psygnosis had done. And it was a really cool demo, but it was completely smoke and mirrors. They really had no technology. It was something where it wasn't streaming. It was a demo where a fighter jet was kind of flying over, some land, and it looked super cool. But what it was doing, if you looked at closely, it had like a 1 second clip of, terrain that it was just looping over and over again. And it was jumping between and it was all loaded into memory, and it was jumping off a floppy disk, and it was jumping in fast cuts back and forth, so you wouldn't notice that the terrain was just looping. Right. But there was kind of the inspiration for someone at JVC saying, "Hey, this would be great for a Star Wars product. Do a Star Wars product with, where you're flying over land or something." And somehow the company got in a deal where they signed a deal to create this product. Nobody knew about it until much, much later. And then later, the company's contractually obligated to okay, let's just get something out. Maybe we'll do it on PC so that we can leave on PC, port to those other two products, and then the PC product is our own, right? But nobody wanted to do it. None of the other project leaders wanted to do it. So, I had some good people kind of liked what I had done with the tools group at the time. And so I think Kelly, maybe in kind of a drunken stupor, had said, "Oh, Vince, I want you to work on this." So that's kind of where it started. Nobody cared about it. It wasn't supposed to be successful. And in a way, that was great because there was just no pressure. It was just kind of get something out the door.
And what was Eric Woolmander's reaction to the fact that she gave you the project without his consent?
I actually don't know. You have to ask Eric about that.
I asked Eric about that.
Oh. Eric is too nice a guy probably to say anything to me, since it wasn't necessarily my decision. But he seemed okay with it to me, but I wouldn't be so surprised, since he was my manager, that I was a resource, and it would be perfectly within his kind of right to say, "Hey, you should come to me if you want to take one of my resources for something."
Now, you're probably aware that Rebel Assault would make extensive use of full motion video throughout the game. So what were some of the technical innovations or creative shortcuts you developed to overcome the hardware limitations of the time?
Okay, are we talking about the actual streaming flying, or are we talking... I can talk about all of it, and it's really kind
of... Talk about all of it.
All right. Rebel Assault 1, the most amazing thing about Rebel Assault 1 is that it worked at all. Because it's a DOS game running on a non-multitasking operating system. In fact, the entirety of Rebel Assault 1 runs out of interrupt. The mainline code is 10 lines of code that's just going in a loop, reading from a file and shoving it in a buffer. Everything else ran out of interrupt, because that's the only way you can kind of fake multitask at the time. And people kind of forget right now where, a multitasking operating system, like video codecs and stuff, are just off the shelf. They come with the operating system. You can just kind of use it. But, we're talking about a machine with, I don't remember what the specs are, something like a megabyte of RAM and, a single speed CD-ROM drive with just 150K per second, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about every screen, every frame had to be compressed down to something like 9 kilobytes, which is insane. I mean, and then you have to shove like audio on top of that and then stream it all together and then any other kind of sprites or anything. And so, fortunately, when I was an Amiga contractor in college, I had worked for a company called, actually, I don't know the company, but I know the product. The product was a product called Vista, and it was a fractal train generator on for the Amiga. I'd done some contract work with that company. And so when Kelly Flock had kind of mentioned the idea at CES, when I got back, the first thing I did was start generating a flyby of still frames on the Amiga in Vista, and then kind of started playing around with compression methods of how I can chop that down into, roughly 10K or less per frame.
Now, you developed Insane for this game, which was and still is a revolutionary engine. Could you elaborate a bit on what made it groundbreaking and how whatever it is that it was doing in the background was achieved?
Okay. The versions of Insane between Rebel Assault 1 and Rebel Assault 2 are actually very different. Like Rebel Assault 1, the processor wasn't even fast enough to do much more than you couldn't do even an additional screen copy, like copying the screen to another buffer. First, you didn't have enough memory for that, and even if you did, you wouldn't be able to do your 10, 12 frames a second if you just with the extra copy. So what it would do is it basically took an image, chopped it up into, I believe, 4x4 cells, and then each cell was mapped to like a tile. So there was a set of standard tiles that were just kind of like normal gradients, like a vertical gradient, a horizontal gradient, a diagonal gradient, and you'd pick the colors in the corners. And so there were these procedurally generated tiles, and then every frame could also have X number of custom tiles. So like basically the system would just by brute force match the whole screen to standard tiles, and then it would sit there and say, what's the worst match? We'll make that one custom, and we'll see if that gets better for any other of the tiles, and then we'll just do that with the budget. Keep on going, and iterating until you've gotten basically until you've run out of budget and all the tiles are found the best match they can out of the pool of both standard ones and individual custom ones that come in with each frame.
Now, in the CD-ROM version of Loom, which was released in spring 1992, the programmers used the Redbook CD audio format to play sound. And less than a year later, digitized sound became common in most LucasArts games, including Rebel Assault. When you began production on Rebel Assault, were you confident that digitized sound would be the best option for the game?
I came to it, it was my choice only because this was my background from the Amiga. It was very common on the Amiga to kind of like, to have digitized sound. And I was a big fan of the Cinemaware games. Mm-hmm. And so the Cinemaware games really kind of had tried to do things with like, really cinematic sounding soundtracks and sound effects and stuff to really kind of make things feel more lively than the beeps and boops you would get from typical games. So given that background, I really wanted to do synthesized sound. And there was something that I recall at the time that was like, the Macintosh at the time had some music player that would do, I think the Mac only had like one digital analog converter, right, on its sound. But they managed to multiplex in real time, like 4 channels into, in software, probably out of interrupt, and mix it in real time to give you 4-channel sound out of the 1-channel hardware on the Mac. And I really wanted to do the same thing on the PC with Rebel Assault. And I did. And it was really primitive because it was like, 4-channel, 6-bit sound in the end being mixed together without an expander, a compression expansion curve, just linearly mixed together so that you could sit there and have music playing in the background. And then you can also have, more than one laser sound firing at the same time, and also an explosion. And so, that's what Rebel Assault did, and that's kind of like my kind of contribution, I think, to the beginnings of digital audio at LucasArts.
Now, I want to show you an early storyboard from Rebel Assault. Do you know this one?
Where did you get a copy of that?
I don't reveal my sources.
Okay, only because I think, I was looking. Oh, that's awesome. That's funny. I was I had done a whole kind of cartoon thing for Rebel Assault 2, and I don't know where it is. I think I might have like Marie Kondoed it away like a couple years ago when I was, thinking nobody's going to want to ever see this sort of stuff. But yes, that looks very familiar.
So what can you share about these early storyboards, given the fact that they're pretty, looks exactly like the final product, even the intro, and you nailed it.
I mean, basically, I recall like taking the blank sheets and printing out a whole bunch of these and just doing them like a cartoon strip and drawing them out. And so I did this one for each level for Rebel Assault 1. And then Rebel Assault 2, I had a lot more where I did cutscenes. And then I also realized that I'm really bad at drawing people. But that's kind of how I like to approach things, was just kind of visually, I really wanted to do like, because I had that background from having been an avid player at CinemaWare, I really wanted things to kind of like be cinematic slash comic book looking.
Now, as we all know, LucasArts handled iconic franchises like Star Wars with great care. How did the balance between the creative freedom they gave you for Rebel Assault coincide with the constraints they probably imposed, or that Lucasfilm probably imposed on LucasArts? Were there any specific limitations on how you could use the Star Wars IP in Rebel Assault?
I don't think a whole lot came up it initially. I think basically when Rebel Assault, especially when Rebel Assault 1 first came, we really weren't on their radar. We hadn't done, we had traditionally been kind of like an independent company doing kind of our independent licenses, Monkey Island, Loom, that sort of thing. Doing Star Wars stuff really kind of started with X-Wing and Rebel Assault. So I think we were off their radar for the most part. Otherwise, they probably would have like said this whole idea of doing like a rookie one or pulling elements from the different movies together. Because when Rebel Assault came out, there was no idea for a sequel, and the technology was so limited in what could compress and still look decent at that time, that I decided to just like pull random elements together from the different movies, shove it together, and put something together that kind of like would pass for a story in almost like an alternate universe. And that probably wouldn't fly to get these days, kind of with, or in later years with licensing really being kind of like really particular on like there being a canon and this is the storyline, et cetera, and trying to keep things consistent. I think things were a lot looser in the early days.
And were there any gameplay elements or sequences you wanted to include but had to cut due to technical limitations or time constraints or budget constraints?
There were a lot of things that were thought of that later didn't come into Rebel Assault 2. Like, when we were thinking of sequences where something appears to like, where you're kind of like going down a path, the speeder bike sequence from Return of the Jedi seemed like an obvious one to do. But when we tried doing a simple sequence and tried compressing it with the Rebel Assault 1 limitations, it just looked horrible. It was just a jumbled mess, and we weren't able to do it, so that was cut. And it wasn't until Rebel Assault 2 where the processors were faster and it had a completely different compression technology that I made up that worked so much better to be able to handle the detail of things like, vertical lines moving quickly like a tree passing you by, that we were able to kind of incorporate that back in.
And this game was specifically designed for CD-ROM, which also drove hardware sales. How did you determine the minimum system requirements for the game, considering, this emerging technology doesn't have any other games you can compare it with? Like, how would you know that the CD-ROM speed would be enough, or how much memory you'd need for this game? How did you come up with the minimum requirements for the game?
The minimum requirements are pretty straightforward, only because it's like when CD-ROMs came out, the these are single speed CD-ROMs. That was all that was available originally, so that was our minimum. At the time, now CD-ROM burners are pretty, I guess if nobody has optical drives anymore, but at some point people had CD-ROM burners as built in our laptop. When we did Rebel Assault, we didn't have a CD-ROM burner in-house. We would actually have to sit there if we wanted to test something on a CD. Everything was tested on a hard drive originally. If we wanted to test on a CD-ROM drive, we'd have to run a hard drive to an external company and pay them a couple $100, and they would burn us one CD for us to take back to test with. That's how, the majority, all of Rebel Assault was developed that way. We didn't have an in-house burner until Rebel Assault 2. And all the videos and stuff we were done that the artist animated, they were recorded on, I forgot the technology, but they were like these magnetic removable cartridge drives.
Zip drives?
I think they were probably zip drives. Yeah, that sounds familiar. So,
okay.
So you asked questions about, sorry, I didn't answer your question about what the minimum requirement is. As I recall, Rebel Assault 1 was also the first product we used a DOS extender on. Just simply because without a DOS extender, if you're just limited to 640K, that wouldn't have been enough to actually make the game plausible. We needed to have full screen buffers. And so in order to get up to 1 or 2 megs, I think it was 1 meg. I have a box here. I could probably read it, but it was the minimum needed to require the game. So, in order to enable the game to run. So if you wanted to stream something off a CD and play back at at least 10 frames a second, that could determine what your minimum machine was going to be.
I remember I had a single speed CD when I played Rebel Assault 1, and it worked perfectly. So, you nailed the minimum requirements. I'll say that. In your article about Rebel Assault in the Adventure, you mentioned it was the first game designed as a CD title from the start, and the first one to include footage from Star Wars movies, and one of the first to use 3D rendered art. What tools and processes did you use for the 3D rendered art, and how did that differ from other games of the era?
Okay, basically up to that time, we were primarily a house that did SCUM games. There was a cartridge group and a PC group, and the PC group did SCUM games, of which I was working in the tools group supporting the actual SCUM engine. And then we had creative folks and scripters that would basically build the games on top of that. And then the cartridge was a completely different side. They were still up at the ranch actually when I started at LucasArts, so they were different. Sorry, remind me what your question. I got on a tangent there.
First of all, you can always go off on tangents. They are very welcome. You can talk for an hour and never answer my question, and that would be perfect. I'll re-ask that question. What tools and processes did you use for the 3D rendered art?
Okay. So basically our art department determined that to use 3D Studio Max. So all our art was rendered in 3D Studio Max, except for is that Rebel 1 or Rebel 2? Except for Rebel 1, there was one sequence where with the character animation that was done by an external person who had actually had pitched doing some work for us. And so they were an external contractor that was hired to actually do those animations. And I don't know what technology they used to actually do that, but it was something very interesting and wonky.
And when you exported the 3D animations, to which file format did you export it?
They were converted to still frames.
Mm-hmm.
Probably JPEGs or BMPs. I don't remember which one at the time.
Or PCX.
Yeah, probably something non-lossy. And then basically, I'm sure it wasn't ping. But then I wrote the tools to actually read those one frame at a time and then compress them into the eventual insane engine. I forgot what extension I used for them, but I think it was something like streaming animation file, like maybe like an SAF or something like that.
And how did you make the animation consistent when it came to skipping frames or keeping the frame rate consistent?
Yeah, that was actually something kind of interesting, and that's where actually my controls background kind of came into play a little bit. There was like kind of a demon that kind of like would watch your frame rate, both what you were trying to, your set point, and then what was achievable. And it used basic PID control to kind of adjust the frame rate to match. So like when things started slowing down, like if it couldn't keep up, either because it was getting data starved or the hardware just couldn't decompress the stuff fast enough, then it would change the target's frame rate over time. So to try to keep it smooth. And what that was kind of interesting because, the data for the sound was also coming in with the stream. So if you're slowing down this frame rate, there's a chance that you're going to get data starved where the sound buffers are going to start running out of sound. And that's where it would do something where you might have noticed in Rebel Assault where like certain times when if there was a hiccup in the hardware and the sound or something, you would get this echoing. So what would happen was the sound buffer would sit there, and if it's got starved, it was just jump back a tenth of a second and replay that last part, which sounded awful for audio, sometimes for voices, but sometimes for music, it wouldn't sound so bad. If the music kind of echoed just a little bit, just to give the frames a little bit of time to catch up and get more sound data to fill this audio buffers.
But when it comes to video glitches, they're more forgivable. But audio glitches are not as forgivable because they're more noticeable and may sound jarring to some. So when you had to skip frames, would you also skip audio? Or apart from the echoing, which is the way it handled a specific point in time in which the hardware couldn't handle everything. But if it noticed that the hardware couldn't handle the next 10 frames or so, or 20 frames or so, would it just skip it?
I believe it would. I believe it would skip video. It would never skip audio. Like audio had priority over the video. So it would try to keep to the audio frame rate. So if the audio got data starved, it would jump back and replay a chunk of audio to kind of give it a little bit of to catch up a little bit, but it never would jump ahead of the video because it almost would consider it would never jump the audio ahead because audio was really kind of almost the marker for absolute time, right? That's what it was trying to achieve.
And LucasArts games in 1993 like 7 Max Hit the Road also featured 3D rendered art, such as the cable car. In the largest ball of twine, there's a cable car, and when they are in the cable car, it looks like a 3D render. Did you use the same technology you did in Rebel Assault for these scenes?
I don't know specifically. You'll have to ask Sean Clark about that or Mike Stemley. I suspect. I don't think we used anything in-house other than 3D Studio Max for rendered stuff. So
the reason I'm asking is because you're credited on the SCUM system. So I wondered if you had to do anything to integrate the 3D art in SCUM.
Yeah. The thing is about the credits at LucasArts is they're very generous as far as like prior work. Like if you worked on an engine and they used your code, then you still got like credited for. It was almost like if you're an artist. If you use an artist and they use your art, then you get credited as being your art being in the game. And I think they took a similar approach to the code. Like by the time Rebel Assault kind of like after I started working on Rebel Assault, I really didn't do a whole lot on SCUM directly per se, other than just kind of help other engineers kind of integrate Insane into it. But I think I still, got credit on those games just because the past work I had done on the SCUM engine was still being used in those games.
Gotcha. Many games at the time had particularly challenging first levels to prevent players from completing them too fast, especially people who are renting the games, which was an option at the time. Was this also the thought process behind the notoriously difficult first level in Beggar's Canyon?
I don't think it was a conscious decision, honestly. It's like maybe it was kind of like I didn't think it was so difficult. But then again, when you're writing a game and you play it so many times, the thing about Rebel Assault, you got to figure it's not that many levels too. So you have to be you have to kind of bias a little on the more difficult side. Because if you just play it one time through and you win, then you're going to finish the whole game and you're not going to really appreciate the experience. So I think it was a combination of both, all of us who are actually testing the game had played the level so much. And since it is streaming, there's not a lot of variety, right? It's kind of the same thing every time that it tends, the longer you play it, the more you kind of like tweak those numbers up a little bit to kind of like, oh, this was too hard. I don't know why I thought this was was hard enough. Let's bump it up a little bit. And I think probably that's kind of the end result reflects that.
That first level was practically impossible, Vince. Just so you know.
I think part of the part with Rebel Assault, with that very first level, is they had the concept of that Y branch, and the Y branch never really worked all that well, just because of the lags in the CD-ROM. You know, when it went to change from one branch to the other, even though they were rendered perfectly smoothly, there's always this hiccup, and you're moving the joystick back and forth. So we have to decide, you know, when you get to that branch, are you intending to go left or are you intending to go right? And the source, I know how the game worked. So I knew like what kind of motion. I'm not going to be wanting to wiggle back and forth when I get to that choice point. I want to be pointed the stick in one direction and have it point consistently in that direction so it doesn't go on the branch where I don't expect it to. But in real life, somebody's just playing, they're moving it back and forth, and they don't expect there to be a branch point. So even though they're swaying to the right, they don't understand why they can't swing to the right and then come back to the left. Well, because when you first swing to the right, you hit the branch point and it says, "Oh, you're intending to go right. I'm going to play that part of. I'm going to branch to the right hand stream instead of staying on the left hand stream." And that's why it's really confusing. And that's why kind of branching. It was kind of an experiment at the time. I mean, the whole game was an experiment. And that really kind of showed that the whole branching based on user, you know, joystick motions just didn't really work.
Yeah, but the team leader tells you in the game that in that Y branch, that if you go to the right, I think it would be easier. And if you go to the left, then it's a bit harder. They're both difficult.
Yes. That's because the dialogue was written before the animations were done. You know, so it was supposed to be that way. But the way it ended up being rendered and we didn't have time to re-render, it's like, okay, we'll go with it. So much of the game was done by the seat of our pants. We barely got the things done. The artists were going full bore. I was programming full bore. Not a lot of time to like test things and try it. And we'll re-render it. It's like, you know, it would take, not only we have to render these things, we'd also have to compress them. And these things took a long time. And Rebel Assault 2 especially, and then later, these things took like, you know, something that might play on screen for like 2 minutes could take, you know, a weekend to compress.
Well, you're like Pixar.
Yeah, so because it was all brute force, all that matching of the tiles and stuff, Rebel Assault 2 had something similar, but even more diabolical. We had to set up whole kind of render farms, not 3D render farms, but like render farms that were running my compression program that I actually had written like a version that would take advantage of multiple cores so it could compress parts of the screens in pieces together to compress this stuff. And this was especially for like after Rebel Assault for Star Wars, the Star Wars Encyclopedia. We were trying to get this thing out the door, and I realized like a couple weeks before, like 3 weeks, I think before shipping, that we didn't have enough computers to compress the videos that we had, in particular like the Millennium Falcon fly through. It had so many frames. I did it off the top of my head calculation. I realized in order to compress all these frames into insane videos to play, we'd have to borrow every computer that was used in every computer in the company over the weekend. To put on our render farm, which we did. It was like a Friday night, and it was like we had somebody in facilities kind of figure out like what the minimum specs on everybody's machine were, and figure out how many machines in the company met our minimum spec. And I went into them and I just installed my software on all these things, wrote them a note, photocopied a note saying, "I apologize, here, call me on my cell phone if you get in on Monday and you find that your computer's been taken over, this is how to reset it, etc." And so we actually like commandeered all these machines I remember being on my rollerblades, skating around inside the company from machine to machine, trying to set them all up because we needed every single machine running on the render farm or on the compression farm that weekend. Otherwise, we weren't going to make our ship date.
The only thing amazing about this story is the fact that you had a cell phone back in 1993.
Maybe it was just my home phone. Let me think about it. Did I have a cell phone? I got a cell phone fairly early. I guess we can check the dates to see, but I remember having a StarTAC. That was like my second phone. So it was still fairly early, but I'm not sure if it was 93 or not. Actually, this was not 93. This was Star Wars Encyclopedia, so it was after Rebel Assault. So this would have been what, 96, 97 probably?
Okay. So we'll get to that. We're still at Rebel Assault.
Rebel Assault.
So the box said, or the minimum requirements mentioned the fact that you can use the keyboard, but I don't remember that keyboard control was part of the game. I only remember that you could move using the mouse and a joystick. Why was keyboard control left out?
I don't remember. Could you not? I thought you could. I thought you could use it. I thought you could use the arrow keys.
Maybe I'm misremembering because I had to buy a joystick. I only bought a joystick to be able to finish that first level, that impossible first level. You know, nowadays when I'm playing Rebel Assault on Aaron Giles's Dream emulator, I'm using the mouse, but today's mouses are more accurate, and you could actually move inside Beggar's Canyon without hitting everything. But back then, you had those.
There's a trick to Beggar's Canyon to make it really easy. I believe it's like, is it Rebel? Yeah, I believe the trick is just watching the shadow. And if I'm remembering correctly, there's a shadow on the wall. And of course, this is not pre-rendered. So what it is the shadow is actually like 10 frames of a sprite that I apply with code that just hard coded to like look at this sprite and they apply a darkening mapping through the color table on whatever is on the right.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you look at the sprite and you look at that shadow sprite and you look at where your ship is and you just keep those things at a constant distance, then you won't hit anything.
If I ever build a time machine, I'll go tell 10-year-old me how to solve. Okay. Now, you talked about the fact that the rendering of the FMV scenes took a lot of time. Were there any FMV scenes or even gameplay elements that were too CPU intensive and had to be changed or removed or simplified?
Well, the great thing about like having a streaming engine is there wasn't all that much. It was almost kind of like it all works or it doesn't, right? If you've got video streaming, it doesn't matter what's in the video. It might not look good, but at least it's always going to play and it's going to keep going. So conceptually, Rebel Assault's pretty simple in that it's like, streaming video, and then there's sprites that can be overlaid on top, and there's some logic for the sprites where you can if you shoot something, it turns on an explosion sprite and it then hides the ship sprite. That sort of thing happens. But the good thing about it is it's kind of an all or nothing thing. So once it's working, then you're just changing the content that feeds into it.
It's interesting because, even with streaming, you sometimes have keyframes. And when there are too many changes or too many keyframes too close to each other, then it may be too CPU intensive. So what you're saying is that you didn't have any keyframes. Each frame was a keyframe. So it doesn't matter what you're rendering.
Yeah, Rebel 1, each frame is a keyframe. Rebel 2, there were no keyframes. Rebel 2, every frame is delted from the previous frame. On a cell-by-cell basis, it can choose to either delta from the previous or, include its raw data. But in general, it's delted from frame to frame.
And if I remember correctly, there were a few issues in the game that required patches from LucasArts, which players had to either order or download via the BBS. Now, given the lack of widespread internet access at the time, how did you test and deploy patches, especially for bugs that were difficult to reproduce?
Well, the interesting thing is, I think all the patches for Rebel Assault we're basically changing the version of our DOS extender, DOS4GW.
Mhm.
So basically, they released updated versions, so we would just basically ship with a new version of DOS4GW. I don't remember actually changing any of the code after that project shipped. Even though years later I discovered I had a bug in my sound driver where one of the sound channels, one of your what was it that I forgot what it was called, but you
The
use jumpers
IRQ?
to change. Yeah, one of them didn't work. Like I think 0 didn't work or something, or the first one didn't work. I discovered it in the code when I was working on Rebel Assault 2, and it's like, how did this get through QA? It never worked.
Now, the game was ported to Mac, 3DO, and the Sega CD. Which of these ports proved to be the most challenging and why?
Okay, let's see. Let me think about this. The Mac one, I believe Aaron Giles did.
Mhm.
I think it was Rebel Assault. I had written it to be, since I was already doing it on multiple platforms, it was very easy. It was written to be, most of it was written to be platform independent. So the main thing you had to do is to figure out how that main loop would work. So on a PC, that main loop was running off interrupt. On the other, on Rebel Assault 2, it could run under Windows 95. So that was actually it was actually a separate thread doing the main loop. So I don't know that I think it was pretty straightforward as far as like the code was set up to isolate things like different endian orders between PC and Mac, and then to separate all the platform specific dependencies and code from the platform independent stuff. Right. So there was like one module that would handle setting up your display and stuff. And then if you could set up your display hardware and then have one routine that took a buffer, an image buffer, and blast it to your screen, that's all you needed to get the display working. There was another module that just handled controls. So it expected your XY joystick and firing in this format. So you would just have to write that piece. So the idea would be the majority of the code should just port on over. You change some flags for saying whether you're a little endian or big endian order, what your integer size. Actually, you didn't have to do integer size because I avoided using int, so that integer size wasn't an issue. But I tried to make it as easy as possible to port between different platforms, just to make it easy on myself. And I think that later it made it easy to port to the other platforms.
But didn't the different specifications of each platform prove to be a problem, or did it just work?
I mean, basically, it either worked or it didn't, and the other platforms were had higher spec, I think, than our initial ones, so it didn't become so difficult. It was just a matter of porting code and getting it to work. I think. No, I don't think there was anything that difficult. I think, for instance, I think the Mac, I think their actual displayed hardware was more flexible than what we were used to on PC, so it actually had an easier time on that. But they may have needed to bump the minimum spec up to support some kind of conversion. But I'm not sure about that. It's been a long time.
It either worked or it didn't is a great mantra for software development.
It was weird working on a project where, uh, it could have failed at any time because we were doing so much stuff that was completely unprecedented, right? It's like we as a company hadn't done it, and a lot of the stuff we were doing really hadn't been done in the industry to the extent that we were trying to do. So looking back, it was very risky, and I don't know if a company would do that sort of thing these days, but again, it helped in that there were very low expectations for the product.
I mean, when they ported Monkey Island 2 for the FM Towns, then they had to remove an entire scene with an entire puzzle from the game because it had vertical scrolling, and FM Towns couldn't handle it. So that's the reason why I'm asking, because different platforms have different limitations.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, probably the one that's most different would be well, we'll get back to that. I got to think about that. I'm not actually quite sure.
Now, during the development of Rebel Assault, you were in touch with Microsoft support. What specific assistance did you need from them?
I don't recall what that. What are you talking about?
Well, there was an interview from way back when you said that you were in contact with Microsoft support for the game.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'm I'm not downing you, but I don't actually remember what that is about.
Okay. Moving on. Rebel Assault was developed while other major titles like 7 Max Hit the Road, Day of the Tentacle, and Star Wars X-Wing were also in production. What was the atmosphere like at LucasArts during this period of time? Was Rebel Assault the underdog in this case, or were there big high expectations from the game?
Well, I kind of alluded this before. There were zero expectations for.
No, but at that point in time,
Rebel
it was after you started development. It probably had a few, proofs of concept.
Well, get the idea. I think the original forecast, lifetime forecast for Rebel Assault 1 was 25,000 units. And then later that got up to 50,000 units. And then right before launch, I think they bumped it up to 100,000 units. And I think we outdid that in the first couple of days.
Mm-hmm.
So to say Rebel Assault was an underdog, I think was an understatement. I mean, I'm not kidding when I say nobody cared about it. And that's what, except for, those of us who are working on it, the artist and myself. It's just kind of like, we just kept plugging away at it, but it wasn't supposed to be a commercial success.
So out of all of these titles, Rebel Assault was the least likely to succeed in the 1993 yearbook?
I think so. I think everybody expected X-Wing to do really well, and there was no reason not to. I mean, Larry Holland was super talented, and it was conceptually, it seemed like a no-brainer, right? Flying Star Wars ships in space and shooting stuff. That seemed like, I think everybody knew that was going to be great, especially after, the success of, Secret Weapons before that. And so it's like Secret Weapons with Star Wars. Secret Weapons had something to, like, it would kind of like, they had like a precedent to kind of like, to rely on, for their forecast to kind of rely on. And I think Sam and Max Hit the Road, it was a scum game, super talented team, great license, great, it was super funny. And I think that was going to be, people had high hopes for that as well. But I think Rebel Assault, people didn't know what to make of it. And to be honest, people didn't even know it was happening. So, unless they were going to come to my desk and stuff, most people didn't even know it was actually going on.
They should have read about it in The Adventurer. Now, games like The Seventh Guest and Myst were released the same year, just before Rebel Assault.
Yes.
Did these titles influence the development process in any way?
I don't know if they influenced it so much. That I think Seventh Guest pretty much kind of like, I mean, because they were doing like snippets of video that were kind of, both those games actually did snippets of video that were kind of preloaded. They weren't trying to stream them. They were able to do much higher resolution. But I think they really kind of helped underscore the idea that like you could do something that's a lot more cinematic. And I'm kind of hats off to them for really, I think Seventh Guest came out like 6 months before Rebel Assault.
Yeah, it came out in April.
Yeah, so I remember seeing that and being really impressed by it. And I thought, this is really kind of cool. I wish my video was as high resolution as theirs was, but, I mean, I liked them as a fan. I don't know how much they actually influenced it other than kind of like it encouraged me to like keep going. Like, yes, this is possible. You can make a CD-ROM product and you can make things that are more cinematic.
Now, given your background in mechanical engineering, did any of those skills influence your game design decisions in this game, particularly with, the technical problem solving required for things like compression and such?
I don't know if it's so much that, I mean, certainly I mentioned a little bit about PID control, which is, something I used in little places to kind of like adjust for the frame rate, et cetera, to kind of make it smooth. And but besides that, I didn't really use anything like that I can think of from my formal mechanical engineering training. But even when I was going to school as a mechanical engineer, I was programming on the side. And so that was my hobby. In a way, I jumped into mechanical engineering because, like, when I was in high school and I was doing everything, and I actually got kind of burnt out on computers a little bit because graphics weren't really a big thing. So um, I decided I wanted to work in an industry where I could kind of like see and feel, what I built a little bit more instead of just working with numbers and printouts, et cetera. And it wasn't until like I got to Berkeley in my freshman year and the Amiga came out, and wow, here's a computer where it's like it's all about multimedia. It's all about sound and video. Much more than at the time CGA color. Stuff that actually looks realistic, and that kind of reignited my interest in computers. And so, um, when I went to do my master's after I got my bachelor's and I decided to go ahead and do my master's, one of the reasons I went into control systems, robotics and control systems as my major was because it's very programming heavy. And I had so much more of a programming background from just stuff I'd done on the side and the contract work I'd done on the side. It was actually really easy. So I was able to kind of just like skate through it. It was like, oh, programming in C, sure, no problem. I'll do the project, the semester's project the last 2 weeks, that sort of thing.
Now, you were the project leader on this project, and you were very hands-on during the development, even recording sounds with your infamous boombox. You also worked nights and weekends during the post-production phase. How did you manage the pressure?
It wasn't really pressure. You're kind of like, I was just driven by adrenaline. I didn't really kind of have any relationships at the time to take my time. So what else I'm going to do with my time? And it was just so exciting. I guess, it's like my social situation has changed now, but I still kind of have that drive where I, like, if I get in a problem I find super interesting, I want to just stay up and keep working on it and keep working on it. Sometimes I'm not able to do that as much now as I used to, but it never felt exhausting to me. Only because maybe, it's like, it's not like I was doing something that somebody else was telling me to do. I was doing something that I found interesting. And I thought if I had an idea for something like, oh, I can improve the compression this way. I was the type of person where I said, I'm going to just stay up all night if it takes to like get a version out so I can test it out. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to sleep anyway. So I might as well stay up and do it.
You mentioned being open to suggestions from the QA team. Could you share any specific feedback from testers that had a significant impact on the game's development?
We had a lot of impact from a lot of different people. Like, to give you an instance, like, okay, so do you know Brett Toasty? I don't know if you talked to him.
No, I have not.
Yeah. Okay. He's a great person to talk to. And he started at the company, and he came from a different background. I believe he used to be in construction before he decided to get into computers. And he started off, I don't know, was he QA? I remember before he became like, I remember like doing Rebel Assault 2. And after Rebel Assault 1, trying to think about, okay, the technology's gone up a little bit, minimum machines up, we now can do double speed CD-ROM drives, we can actually do off-screen buffers, we can do all sorts of stuff that we couldn't do on Rebel Assault 1. It can make and I'd been playing around with compression and could do so much more than the first game could. We weren't limited to like, oh, we have to be in space where, or we can't just do like Rebel Assault 1, if you've noticed, all the backgrounds, all the video was all monotone. It was just one color palette, one linear, I think it was just like 16 shades of one color. And that was a limitation of the bit rate that we had, because, with 8K a frame is only so much you can do. But Rebel Assault 2 had a lot more that we were capable of. And I remember trying to figure out, okay, without that limitation, what can we do for a game? And I remember Brett Toasty and I sitting in the room and sketching out like every thing that we wanted to do. And if you look at Rebel Assault 2 and you look at the game play portions, there's first person stuff, there's second person stuff, there's third person stuff. Every perspective is there, right? And there are parts that are kind of like, there are parts where when you've got the character and you're like tucked behind corners and you're shooting, those are things that like Brett and I were both really big fans of Time Crisis. And so it's exactly the same thing. You think about, right? You tuck behind something, you jump out, you shoot, and then you duck away again. And we thought that like, okay, like flying TIE fighter level, shooting TIE fighters are always fun, right? But how many can you have in a game? So you could say, okay, we'll do TIE fighters, but we can't do too many. So we'll just do, I don't remember how we did two of those. And then like asteroids are fun. We'll figure out a way to do 2 asteroid levels. We'll do a first person, the second person, third person, figure out all the game elements, and then figure a way to stitch a story around all of them so that you can not have any two of the same elements next to each other, but build a story that fits it all. And that's where the whole Phantom TIE Fighter things come from. And that was just Brett and me in a room, nothing formal, just because he was interested, I was interested, and we sketched out the whole game that evening. And that's why like Brett has a credit in the game, even though I don't believe he was formally on it, because he was really instrumental in us having that conversation that one night and sketching out the whole game.
Wow. And Smush, the custom multimedia tool that you created for Rebel Assault 1, became a key asset for compressing and managing the game's data. And I want to share a screenshot with you. Here's Smush.
Oh, yes.
So what can you share about its development?
Wow. Okay. So that was the original, low res version. Later, I ended up, after doing VPaint, I ended up doing a higher res version. So that's SAD. That's what I was looking for. Streamed animation. I forgot what the D stood for. All right. So that was basically built on top of a framework that Brad originally developed. The low res version was to, your basic GUI interface. Drop-down menus, buttons, etc., and font rendering. You got to remember back in those days, you couldn't take things like text for granted. If you wanted to draw text, you had to draw your own fonts and then write your own system to draw text and wrap it if necessary. So that's kind of how primitive everything was at the time. And so this was just the original tool to kind of like, not just like process video, but also to layer it. So each of those bars, it looks kind of like, what a modern, I'm sure when you edit your podcast, you probably have some video editor that's kind of similar where you've got timelines and you've got like audio and you've got video. At the time, I had nothing to go on, so I didn't know how it was supposed to be, how these things are supposed to work, but this kind of seemed obvious to me that like I wanted something where I could take each file, drag it up into a timeline, and then layer things together, and then have the tool run. And what it would do is each one of those vertical columns represented one frame of data. So that would be, it would take a piece of each one of those bars, wrap it up together, and that would be the chunk that would be streamed up from the CD-ROM for each frame.
So in this screenshot, we see an animation that has 33 frames of a droid. Star Wars Cutscene 1 droid.
Yep, and you see things like the TIE Boom.SAD. So that's like a sprite that gets loaded, that gets loaded up, so that if you shoot it, then it gets enabled. And so if you look at the way the game works, it's like there's a sprite animation that kind of follows, your targets, in these case TIE fighters. And so if you shoot a TIE fighter, it hides the TIE fighter sprite and then shows the explosion sprite.
Yeah. So at the bottom, you can see the animation that's selected, but at the top, you see the entire timeline that has, according to this, 395 frames. This looks better than Adobe Premiere, I have to say. Well done. Well done, Vince. I mean, years later, they had the same look and feel for Adobe Flash, which I also used. But this looks much more user-friendly. So, well done.
Yeah, it was cool, really cool being able to like having a background in tools to be able to make my own tools, because it was able to like, you could really accelerate your development instead of you're never fighting with your tool, because it's like, oh, first you know how it works inside and out, but also if it doesn't do what you need it to do, you can go ahead and just go into the code and then automate something or add a feature, and then you can keep on going.
And were there any challenges, legal or technical challenges, with working with John Williams' score beyond the digitization process? Things like securing the licensing or integrating it to the game.
Yeah, I remember that was the big. Okay, I remember the day it happened first when the original plan for Rebel Assault was going to be like all the other games to just go ahead and use iMuse to play back, your sound card based sound, right? And I remember playing, the original Star Wars opening score, through that. It was boop boop beep 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 beep, and I was just like, I was really sad. It was so awful. Not that like obviously it was what it was technology wise, but compared to a movie, it felt very computer gamey and not at all what I was thinking when I was thinking. It's like, hey, we're having streaming video. The music really needs to kind of like be very similar. And I remember like doing just recording like a minute on my Amiga off the CD and playing it back and just as a demo. And I remember showing to other people saying, can we do this? Can we do this? And I remember it was a big question. We didn't know, like, obviously we knew that like we had released the CDs, but what are the legal implications? Had no idea. And that was one of the things we had to bounce off the licensing saying, please let us do this, and I don't know what the actual like legal details were. Did we have to pay an extra licensing fee? Was this already covered over some of the licenses already? Did Lucas as a company already own this stuff? I don't know. But when I heard back that, yes, we could do this, I was overjoyed.
And how did you feel about the pressure of tying the game's success to the adoption of the CD-ROM drive?
Again, there was no pressure. There was no pressure because the project wasn't supposed to succeed anyway. So it was all gravy.
I mean, usually when a project comes out, then it either sells well or not, according to whether or not it's a good game. But in this instance, you had to deal with things like nobody had a CD-ROM drive. So hopefully everyone gets one by the time the game comes out.
I think the part of the problem, or not part of the problem, part of the wonderful things was I was like, since I'd come from the tools group and I was a first-time project leader, I didn't just getting it out at all. Having created the game, itself was an accomplishment for me. That was enough to make me happy. I wasn't actually thinking about. I thought it was going to be a success, and I was certainly hoping it, but there was no pressure on my part, especially since nobody else cared about it. As I started getting like other people's feedback when I would show it to them, people who weren't in the company, and I started getting an inkling that yes, this thing had a chance to really take off, but I don't think it was really on top of mind to like, oh, this is a number, I wanted to reach, especially since you got to think about right now. Think about like how LucasArts was at the time. Right now, we think about LucasArts and we think about how LucasArts really was kind of at the pinnacle of gaming at that time, right? And certainly we loved the products that we worked on, but I think before X-Wing, the company never really had a financial success. We had critical successes, but if you look at the actual numbers for like Loom and Monkey Island, they were pretty modest as far as the industry goes. And I think X-Wing, which came out before, Rebel Assault, was the first one where it's like, wow, there's really real money to be had here. And I think before that, pressure really wasn't. There wasn't a pressure to be successful because we had never really been successful, at least from a financial point of view before.
Now, Rebel Assault 2 was advertised as the first live footage since Return of the Jedi, but, in my conversation with Bill Tiller, he blew my mind when he told me that you guys filmed new footage for Rebel Assault 1 as well, because he mentioned working with you on blending employee faces into scenes from the Star Wars movies for the game itself.
It was at a very, very primitive level. Like if you look at the characters in Rebel Assault 1, like the the face shots of the pilots inside there, they're based on characters. They're based on people inside the company, right? Like, like Colette Michaud was a her face was used a lot, which is, she's very telegenic, and the artist really loved her, so her face was used. But they were really kind of drawing over still frames and then taking representative frames to animate the mouths, right? So it was all still hand animated, but it was kind of rotoscoped, and not rotoscoping at her actually saying anything and replaying those frames in general. But most of the scenes were just taking like, here's a mouth open shape, here's a mouth closed frame. Let's draw those frames and then hand animating those in some kind of sequence. The only one scene which was actually filmed as video as opposed to still frames was one scene which was Colette and Justin Graham. And there's one scene where they're sitting talking in like a cafe or something like that. And then an alarm goes off and they have to get to their ships. And that was something that was actually, that one scene was filmed as video, but it wasn't played back as video. Again, after we took the video, we took representative still frames and then hand animated it. In part because kind of like the video was really raw. Neither of those people were actors. And so it was kind of like, it was used as a source for still animation. But it wasn't really until Rebel Assault 2 where they actually would take a whole sequence, record, all those frames, and then without, hand manipulation, just play them back in sequence as they were recorded. So in a way, it's kind of like, both were correct.
Fair enough. And Casey Ackley oversaw the late stages of production as an associate producer. And here's a photo of you both.
Yes.
What can you share about the final stages of development and about working with Casey?
I mean, Casey was really awesome. She was a person who was a really go-getter person. She came from, the earlier version of Lucas Learning. I think it was Lucas Gleff, was it? I'm not sure about that. So she had effectively been kind of a project leader over at Education when doing the project that they had a project they were doing for future education. So she was really good at kind of organizing and making sure things got done. And there was a lot of that near the end when we were trying to assemble resources and get all the video assets together, or I guess, the animation assets together, get the sound assets together, and get things compressed, get CDs burned, get the marketing materials together. And so she was really instrumental in kind of tying all that together and just manage the chaos, because it was chaos.
Sounds like it. And at the end of production, you also got yourself a Rebel Assault license plate. How long did you keep it?
I still have it. I don't have the car anymore, but like when I returned the car, I sent back one of the license plates, but I said, I don't know what happened to the other one. I still have it. It's on my wall up on the other side here of my office.
Wow. And look, George Lucas also wrote you guys a letter after a few months.
He did, yes. I still have that letter as well.
What was it like to get a letter from George? It was March 3rd, 1984, so it's like 4 months or so after the game was released.
Yeah, I mean, what can I tell you? It was actually really cool. You could tell that, George was proud of what we had done, and when you hear from the guy that you managed to actually get on his radar and impress him somehow, I think that's definitely one of those points in your life that you just kind of remember. It's like, that was awesome.
And around that time, LucasArts also had some amazing Halloween parties, and you showed up in one of them in the workloader costume from Aliens. Now, you didn't fit through the door, so they had to open the bay doors to let you in.
They did. Okay. I wish cell phones had video recording at the time or something like that, because it's one thing I will never forget. Because I remember I had my roommate and her boyfriend and myself. We were my date at the time. we were like walking out there, and I had this beat up old pickup truck, and that I carried the thing in the back end. I remember getting into it, and we had to walk over to what was then called, it was called Cookie Bay, I believe. I don't know why. Probably because, there was a cookie cart or something there. And I remember, walking towards the place. And of course, it was just like Aliens, where they have to, raise the cargo bay door, because I remember walking there, and there's just a little normal entrance door on the side of it. And I remember walking towards it, and I had I had this little sound box that was operated by my thumb that I could time. And it was actually, I had taken one of those greeting cards where you can record a voice greeting, because sound recording hardware, you could just get it off the shelf. I took one of those greeting cards and then soldered lines off the speaker into an amplifier so I could play it back, and it was on my backpack, and I could push, and I recorded off a VHS tape of the movie, the sound of the thing walking and stomping. And so as I walked, I would push this button each time so I'd have a sound sample so you could hear the sounds every step I took. And then I had a siren on top of me, which I had gotten off like a toy fireman's helmet, and it mounted on top. So it was this red spinning light. And I remember walking in this thing. And I remember not being kind of afraid. I had my roommate and her boyfriend on either side of me in case I fell over, because I was afraid, my legs were strapped into ski boots that were bolted onto this 2x4 frame it was a kind of a skeleton of 2x4s and door hinges. They were bolted together. And then I built the foam pieces and the big plastic piece on the back and everything, and PVC pipe shell. I was strapped into this thing. So I was afraid if it fell over, I might break my back. And it wasn't until later that after walking that I realized it's like, okay, it's actually pretty stable. And but I was walking towards Cookie Bay. And as I was walking toward Cookie Bay, playing the sounds, and it was pitch black, right? And walking up to this dim light that was outside this door, people started streaming out of the door one at a time. And they would stream out, and then it would call other people and pull them out. And so before you knew it, there was this stream of people growing and growing outside, and people were screaming, they were seeing the second coming of Elvis or something. I felt like a rock star. And then, of course, when I got to the door, there was a big crowd around it, and then they had to pull the door open to let me in. And then I think I pretty much ruined the Halloween party for everybody else at the Lucas companies, because I think what happened was, these people were special effects professionals. Most of the people at ILM certainly, but nobody had really thought of doing anything, outside of their job beyond just your normal Halloween costume. And I started an arms race after that. After that, I was never able to compete, because all of a sudden, here's the pros really know what they're doing, would build these incredible costumes. Some of them would start the day after, the previous, Halloween party. They would sit there and start planning for their next year. And there was amazing ones after that. But then became the whole idea of floats as costumes as opposed to just costumes. So it got out of control after that, but that was one of the things I was, I'm probably not going to forget. Here I have another picture here that shows that costume a little bit better. Yeah, so it's kind of here's a full frame.
Wow.
So you can see I'm standing about a foot off the ground, strapped into ski boots.
It's amazing.
So
well done. It seems like you were the first one who used what you learned on the job to work on the costume, because even when you explain the process of creating this costume, you mentioned the fact that you didn't have any audio devices, so you had to record it on a greeting card, which is similar to the fact that you didn't have digitized sound, so you record from a boombox and then converted it.
Yeah. Well, okay. I'll give you a story about where the idea for coming that costume came from in the first place. It was from the opening, because my roommate at the time my housemate at the time was a fan. It was from the opening of Mystery Science Theater 3000, where you have him in some kind of PVC sort of thing that was like the power loader, and he's playing drums or something like that. And then so that got me thinking, a power loader out of PVC pipe. What about maybe I could make a power loader? And so that's when I started experimenting with ski boots and 2x4s and stuff in my backyard, just like bolting something together and say, can I stand on this thing? Can I walk around this thing? Can I not die in this thing? And so that was that.
Okay, now for the prop I brought earlier, I have the Hebrew manual for Rebel Assault.
Ooh.
So the game wasn't localized, but we did have a localized big box. So I had a manual in Hebrew, and the big box was in Hebrew.
Oh, that's too bad we didn't localize it. I did actually write a lot of different localized versions. So I guess somebody didn't think of it as a market, but technology certainly was there.
The only LucasArts game that was localized over here was Loom, and even that wasn't localized by you guys. We didn't even get the Scum tools to localize it over here. So a local company bought the rights to Loom and then hacked the Scum engine and changed the text. Like they took the font files and hacked them so that it would have Hebrew characters. And then they changed the text. And the only thing they noticed is that the text has to be shorter than the English text, because otherwise the layout would break apart. And so the entire game was localized, sold over here, and it was mainly hacked.
That's awesome. Good thing Scum didn't have any checksums or anything on its data files.
Yeah, because one of the things with Aaron Giles's Dream emulator is the fact that it was impossible to detect the Hebrew version because the executable was never changed. It's the executable of the English version because it wasn't compiled in Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
It was the English version was hacked to have Hebrew characters. So anyway, that's the thing. In 1995, you received special thanks on Mortal Kombat 3. What did you do to earn this acknowledgement?
Nothing. I have no idea what that is. That's probably another Vince Lee. That's my doppelganger.
Probably. Still in 1995, you were credited for an actual credit this time. You were credited for Almost Drove Him Crazy on Full Throttle. Is it safe to say that what drove you crazy was insane, or was it something else?
We actually don't know what that is. Full Throttle was awesome, and it was a fun project. They had good people working on it. I don't know what. I think maybe that's just a pun on the insane, acronym. I think that's probably what it is.
I know that insane was used in Full Throttle, but making the switch to the cartoon style created some challenges in the engine. Can you share what those issues were?
Well, I mean, it actually kind of thing. I believe it was Outlaws where we really first tested. This is still in the very early stages of Rebel Assault 2, and I'd been playing around after Rebel Assault 1 with different types of compression. Now, remember, whereas Rebel 1, every frame is a keyframe, Rebel 2 really did diffing between frames, where every frame could end up being a source of data for the second frame. And there was this really weird thing that I did where, like, if you have a cell in frame, in a particular frame, it would look for matches in the previous frame. And it would look in kind of the spiral pattern, starting at the same location and then spiraling out away from there. And that was something like, somewhere in the order of 200, 240 different like spiral relative positions it would check. And these relative positions were just kind of like, they were just chosen from a bunch of sample videos and seeing, how much things moved. And the idea would be anything moving on screen, even if it's a camera movement or the object itself moving, you tend to see the same shape appear in a previous frame, especially when you've got like something that's kind of blurred a little bit, then it's very similar. And so if you can track that motion, you can get a lot of that data from the previous frame, right? But in addition to that, it took the concept of, in Rebel Assault 1, they had the idea of these special tiles, the custom tiles that came in with each frame. Rebel 2 had this idea where it could also do this kind of like had these fixed shapes, and there were shapes that were really good at, they were specifically designed to handle cases like thin lines and hard edges. So there were special tiles where there would be a dividing line, vertical, horizontal, at an angle, and then encoded in that tile would be two colors. So it would be like a dividing line with one color and another color. So maybe of the bit stream that would come in, there would be the number of bits or number of bytes to define each tile was variable. So if it was a simple delta, it would just be 1 byte. But then out of that, 256 different values you could get in for each tile, some of those bytes would require additional bytes. So let's say you got a 255 in, then it would expect, 3 more bytes. And the next, maybe that's for a special tile. And the next one would be the tile shape. And the next two would be the 2 tile colors to make up that shape. And that was designed to handle quick scene transitions. Like if you went from black to white, or things like animation for Outlaws and then later for Full Throttle, where you've got a lot of cartoon shapes that might be moving. And one of the things if you take traditional video animation and you apply it to if you take a traditional video codec and apply it to animation, what you tend to get is everything just kind of blurs out when things move really quickly, right? Whereas I built a system that was specifically designed to try to track hard edges of different colors and be able to build those from scratch. So what you end up seeing instead is something where it looks kind of grainy, but still sharp. And so you could have a really quick transition, and it could build a frame entirely or mostly out of those custom frames. And so things wouldn't get blurry. It would look a little grainy, as I said, but it would compress animation really well. And it worked for normal stuff too, but it worked especially well for animation, which normal codecs didn't support very well.
Yeah, so the solid colors created the same compression effects we all knew from the 90s.
Yeah.
Now, in the game, in this game, the Insane engine had to be started up for the cutscenes and then shut down before returning to the Scum engine. Can you talk about the process of integrating these two engines so that they would work together in a way that would not require them to work at the same time, but actually start up and shut down each other?
Yeah, well, my involvement was basically at that point when there was basically the desire. They tested out for Outlaws, they tested out like a third-party video solution. And it was another one that was designed for video. So it turns out like it ended up making things kind of blurry and / cloudy. And so they decided to go ahead and use Insane. And so my involvement once that occurred was to try to take the Insane engine, extract it from the game, and make it a modular component that could be easily integrated into another product. So basically the interface was something like, you have the file. So if you want to play a file, you could, to start the engine, you'd basically say, you'd start the engine, give it the file you want to play, and then there would be a place where it would hook into the video where it's like, okay, it's gonna write the decompressed video into this buffer, so then you can go ahead and integrate it into your app to display it. And that's kind of my part of was building that part, making it modular, and then handing it off to, I believe it was Brett Mogilewski, who was the lead programmer on Full Throttle, to get that working.
No, Brett Mogilewski was the lead programmer on Grim Fandango.
Oh, Grim Fandango, that's right.
Now, that same year, The Dig came out, and The Dig is known to have had a very long and troubled development, lasting around 6 years. Yeah. Due to various delays. By the time the game reached its final stages of production, it had started to look somewhat dated. That's why the decision was made to include animated cutscenes powered by the Insane engine. Could you elaborate a bit on the process of integrating Insane into The Dig?
I think the process was pretty simple as the other games. At this point, as you said, this had been a project that had been going along for a while. At this point, I had already extracted the Insane engine off to a separate component. So I didn't actually need to be involved in the actual integration myself.
Well, at least you got a credit. out
Yeah,
of it.
it was already something that had been, especially since like the original version of the Dig, it was going to be, originally it was going to be Scum, then it was going to be a custom engine written in C, then later it went back to being a Scum. But at that
Scum,
point,
Story Droid, and Scum.
yeah, so I believe at that point, there was already support for Insane in the Scum engine. So I don't think there was that much that needed to be done at that point because it had already been done prior. And that's one of the strengths of the Scum engine. It was it was a system basically that you could build games on top of, and it kept building capabilities as the years went on. And once somebody had done it, then then the extra work on top was just the creatives, building the content for it. The engine was already had been expanded at that point to support more capabilities.
Still in 1995, you were credited, among other things, as the project leader on Rebel Assault 2: The Hidden Empire, which is my favorite Star Wars game, just so you know. This was the first time George Lucas let anyone else film live-action Star Wars footage. When were you first approached about the project?
I don't remember, honestly. I think it was kind of like after Rebel Assault 1, I was kind of burnt out. But I don't remember what the process was. I think it kind of happened organically in between like improvements in machines, their capabilities, and what was possible, things that I hadn't been doing for experimenting on the side. And then I think there was obviously, a company having the desire to kind of build on the success of Rebel Assault 2, on Rebel Assault 1, and building a companion, a second follow-up product. And I think it all kind of came together, but I don't remember the specifics. It was a very long time ago.
How long was the game in production? Do you remember that at least?
Yeah, Rebel 1 and Rebel 2 were both about 2 years. So if you think about like, it was from like winter 93 was when Rebel 1 shipped, and then winter 95 is when Rebel 2 shipped.
So that means they started production on Rebel 2 immediately after Rebel 1 was released.
Well, I mean, it's certainly I don't know when things were like official Rebel 2, but considering how Rebel 1 kind of worked, I was experimenting in the code continuously throughout the development, both of Rebel 1 and Rebel 2 and the time in between. So I don't remember officially what was, rubber stamped as Rebel 2 as was going to be a product, but certainly from the programming point of view, there was code written all during the time that ended up going into Rebel 2.
Now, you talked earlier about the storyboards you made for Rebel Assault 2. Luckily, we have various drawings over here. See the drawings?
Let's see.
See these?
Yeah, those are not my drawings. Those are Paul's drawings. Paul actually, Paul Topoulos, obviously, he is an actual storyboard artist, so he actually made good drawings. But the thing is, I had sketched out the whole game with really crudely drawn drawings where actually, in order to save myself from redrawing things multiple times, I ended up photocopying. I would draw like a stormtrooper and then make a dozen photocopies of it in different sizes and then cut and paste those. I remember I had pages and pages of cut and pasted drawings. Then I photocopied again to make my my storyboards. And one of the things is I knew nothing about camera placement at the time. So like all my shots were like far, they would say, I would write the dialogue like a comic book, what do people say, what happens here, etc. But I didn't really know anything about like focusing in and zooming in on the faces and stuff. And that was a huge difference because when Paul redid the storyboards, they actually look like storyboards where he put actually good, camera placement and framing and stuff. And it's like, oh, I learned a lot about actual like cinematography from his storyboards.
Wait, so you're telling me that these are not your storyboards?
If they're well drawn, they're not mine. There is like some article that has a screenshot of mine, like one screen something, and they look kind of like they're all black and white, kind of cartoon style. Not quite stick figures, but probably only a step above that.
Well, it's in one of these pages in the official player's guide. I'm certain.
Yeah, someone else has pointed it out to me a while ago. I just don't remember where it was. And that's the only thing. I had them somewhere. I thought they were in my attic, but again, I think I Marie Kondoed it. Like,
Okay. The game itself featured 175 video shots and about 45 minutes of footage. How long did it take to film all of these scenes in the game?
we filmed in a green screen stage in Greenbrae, and I'm trying to think. I think it was something like 4 days. I might be off a day or something like that, but I think it was like 3 or 4 days of filming.
Wow. And how much pre-production did you need before these 3 days?
I don't recall. I know that we had a crew that built things like there was basically a chair mounted on an inner tube, and that was used for all the ship scenes. And so we had like crewmen who would kind of like had 2x4s. They were mounted at the base of it. They would rock it and stuff, and somebody got shot. And so we could film the person with natural body motion and stuff on that. So that had to be built. We didn't really have much more other than sets because everything else was just virtual. So that was pretty straightforward. But I remember it was a pretty fast deal.
And you worked with Hal Barwood on, in a way,
Yes,
on Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, but you didn't work with him directly, probably because you worked on the tools themselves.
Yeah.
And he worked on the story. But in this game, you actually collaborated with Hollywood writer Hal Barwood
and director. Yes, Hal was a real pro, and especially I think the thing that he was really good at was, he was very sensitive to the fact that this wasn't his project, but I think also having that kind of like detachment from a project makes you really kind of like be really mission oriented. And so he could just like get the shots out, boom, boom, boom. And I remember he would just like, at the same time, I think it was kind of like some other studios were experimenting with video, and it had people who weren't professional video folks, who weren't from the movie industry trying to actually do that role. And I think they had, difficulties. Whereas Hal, this was something that he had a lot of experience in. So, he would just get the shots out. And I remember what he would do is like, he would direct the actors, they would do the scene, and then he would just look at me, and I would just give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And 99% of the time, I would give a thumbs up. I think one time I had a comment where I think like the stormtroopers were being shot at from off screen. They turned around, and I thought when they turned around, they should know exactly immediately where the shots came from because they were aiming directly at the target. And that was like I was proud. That was my only comment on saying, oh, hey, maybe we could, do it again with them kind of like not knowing where to shoot when they turn around. Other than that, I just kind of let Hal do his thing, and he did it great.
And as you probably know, the game has tons of Easter eggs. Who was in charge of adding them all, and who had the idea to add so many of them?
That was all me. We had time at the end of it, so I don't even know if all the Easter eggs have been published at this point. There are probably still ones that are unknown that are still there. So, but yeah, obviously it's kind of like there are all the game tray ones, the game ones. They're the three. Was it is no try, let go, and join me? Are the keywords to get to the 3 different levels, and then when you're at each level, there are all sorts of keys that you can reset health and gain health, lose health, which is used for testing and stuff. They're all the personal pages, so there's it's just something I wanted to do. I always thought it was kind of fun, and I had the opportunity, so I put stuff in.
Well, first of all, it's great. Second of all, what do you mean not all the Easter eggs were found? Are you sure that there are Easter eggs that were not found in Rebel Assault 2?
I am not sure, but I think there might be some. I don't even remember all of them, but there were a lot of Easter eggs that were put in there. And there were some of them that like in Rebel Assault 2 and also some subsequent products like, the Star Wars Encyclopedia, there was a lot of them in there as well. Maybe somebody at this point has disassembled the code and kind of like found them all, but I wouldn't be surprised if at least on some of those products, there are ones that haven't been found yet. they're not of general use. They're especially on Star Wars Encyclopedia. Basically, everybody on the team was able to put in their own personal page. So,
well, now we have to do a live stream together in which we'll play Rebel Assault 2 from beginning to end and check out all of the Easter eggs. And then you'll have to.
Well, which ones have been published? I don't know. Which ones do you know about?
Well, you have the Mystery Science Theater one.
Yep.
You know what? Let me.
There's check. Movie mode. There's Mystery Science Theater. There's the 3. There's.
You ask for it, so let's watch all of the Easter eggs.
Awesome.
And then you'll have to acknowledge whether or not they're all here.
I mean, there may be ones there that I don't remember, so.
Be on the lookout for anything unusual.
It's been all clear here. Nothing to report.
Yep, I remember that one.
Stay alert. If you screw up one more time, I'll have you transferred to a refuse barge where you'll stay for the next 20 years.
Oh yeah, that's me in the green there.
Oh, kid, I didn't think you had it
really?
in.
Thank you, sir.
Because I'm short enough to fit the costume.
Without the advantage of their phantom fleet, the Empire will have to face us
So you
on
only
equal
see me
ground.
for a second.
Once again, you saved us all. You even faced a little competition. I guess that entitles you to this.
There, see?
Hey, there you are.
Oh, kid, I didn't think you had it in you.
Thank you, sir.
Looks like the Alliance owes you a debt of gratitude. Without the advantage of their phantom fleet, the Empire will have to face us on equal ground. Once again, you saved us all. You had it pretty rough out there, kid, and you still came through okay. You can fly with me anytime.
Just like in Top Gun. You can be my wingman anytime.
Well, they didn't blow us away yet. That's a good sign.
Yeah, so far so good.
Yep, here we are, 2 rebel spies in the heart of an Imperial command ship, surrounded by the Emperor's finest.
Is that Hal?
Sorry.
It's Amy? Okay, someone must have gone through the code and found all the strings.
Have identified the attackers as modified B-38 assault starfighter.
That's
I wasn't going to be the one. I was not going to be the one.
okay. That's me reading those lines standing on top of a ladder. So I'm doing my best Akbar impression, which is why everybody cracked up.
As you can see, Lord Vader, the units perform admirably. In fact, I think the whole project has proved quite impressive. Why, in a few years, we'll be able to take care of the world at large and psychologically have bad toilet training, and all will be well. Everything will be just fine, absolutely. I'm hoping to...
And that's it. So are there any other Easter eggs?
That is awesome. There may be. I don't remember. I can't think of any off the top of my head, so maybe not. So
Now I won't be able to sleep at night.
I'm sure someone else has definitively looked through the code. So that's probably all of them.
Okay.
Probably.
Now, in the non-interactive demo and in the early marketing, you use the Apple-styled numeral in the logo.
Yeah, I actually don't know. Yeah, I don't know why that change was made. It wasn't something that I specifically was involved in.
So you don't remember why or when it was changed?
I don't know if it was even a conscious decision to do it other than like a lot of this artwork was just done by one individual person who was asked by marketing, hey, we need something. Can you do this? So I don't know if it was the same person or different people and they had different takes. It's not like we had a super like style guide and this is what the Rebel Assault logo was is supposed to look like. We were everything was really kind of like loosey-goosey in those days. Not like today where everything has to be locked down legally, where this is the official logo, we're going to trademark it. And there you go. God, I was so young back then.
You look the same.
Look
You
at
look
my
younger
hair.
now.
Again, Mac cameras and their stupid beautification filters.
And so this was you on the set. This is one of the spaceship props.
Yes, I remember that. Oh, I love that. I later made like a nose cone for that. And I never did what I really wanted to do was I wanted to do like a false perspective background on it to do the wings, but never got around to that. I think by time, I would have had time. That's when kind of like the Marin County Fair kind of decided not to highlight the Lucas companies anymore.
And it has the new logo, not the one we saw earlier.
Yeah. But yeah, that's something I built out of my garage, out of like, plywood. And there used to be a place near the Oakland airport in the Bay Area where it was just filled with salvage material from the old Silicon Valley back when they used to actually make electronics in when Silicon Valley really was not software, it was actually hardware. And there's this, I forgot what it was called, but there's this vast, it actually was an airplane hangar just full of electronic junk. And I remember going there and getting like panels from old equipment, copiers, etc., for the internals of this fake little X-wing piece.
So you had ILM at your disposal, but you went through a junkyard to get all these.
Where do you think ILM got their stuff? ILM would go dumpster diving for parts and stuff too. I'm sure that's where they got, interesting looking shape pieces.
So why is it so expensive to create visual effects if you're looking through dumpsters?
I think probably because it's like, it takes a lot of time, right? Visual effects are expensive, not because of the materials. I'm sure that's part of it, but it's the labor, right? Speaking of props, you brought a prop, so I have my one prop from Rebel Assault 2. So you might remember this since you're a fan, so I still have this.
Wow.
So this is, if you look at the back of it, I don't know if you can see that, but there are some instructions because it's actually, this is like a plastic calculator case that I think I got from the same place, that same airplane hangar. And I don't know what piece of equipment this is that I cut it out and cut a hole and sunk it in there and then weathered the whole thing. But this is the prop that Jameson Jones used when he crash landed on the planet.
This is so awesome. You should sell it on eBay. No, actually, don't sell it on eBay.
No. This is it's not taking a lot of space, so I don't have a reason to get rid of it, so I'm saving it.
So this is Hal directing a scene over here.
Yeah, with Julie and Jameson. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And here's you and Hal working on scene. Is it the same costume you wore in the ending?
Yes. Wow, I didn't actually. Yeah, I remember the shot, but I didn't realize I was actually in the edge of that frame.
So now you know. Maybe these were your work clothes and not an actual, costume.
No, they're definitely They're definitely the costume because it's got the strap in it there, and I wouldn't wear something green anyway. In general, I don't think.
On the other hand, I don't remember that anyone in the Rebel Alliance wore anything green. So I think these are your work clothes, and you're just yanking our chains.
I don't know where that actually. Yep, I have that photo.
There you are. These are other work clothes.
What's really funny is that I actually look tall in here because I'm standing in front of everybody else. Because I took the photo, I remember running up and putting the photo on a ladder, the camera on a ladder, and then getting back. And so I'm actually standing. It's almost like the shot where, they have the shot where they've got, oh God, what's his name? I feel like I'm like, in front of all the Muppets, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's because I'm actually standing in front of everybody. So it looks like I'm kind of like towering everybody, even though I'm not a very tall person. So
again, you're using what you learned on the job. You learned how to use camera perspective to your advantage.
it wasn't something intentional. It was just that, like, the camera's going to go off, and that's as far back as I could get.
Gotcha.
I don't know what I was thinking of that, vest and striped shirt, though. I was young. I didn't know any better.
Now, during the production of Rebel Assault 2, Windows 95 came out. So I assume that you knew Rebel Assault 2 would require Windows 95 support on release.
Yes.
Did that affect the development process in any way?
Not really. We basically, the original DOS version, I just continued along with that. We hired another programmer to kind of who was working on other stuff, who also knew Windows 95, who wrote like a Windows 95 shell, where that kind of main loop I mentioned a little bit earlier was actually running in Windows 95 as opposed to inside DOS. But essentially, the code was already separated out, so it was able to just straight out compile, other than just that main loop, and then little bits to kind of tie in the display and the controls.
Now, on April 24th, 1996, you apparently finished writing the design document for Streamliners. Now, in my recent conversation with Eric Wilmunder, he showed me his copy of the design document.
Streamliners. From the Adventures of Chance Adams. Do you ever remember that one?
Chance Adams.
That's embarrassing.
And we went over like 100 other design documents.
Yep. Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny. The funny thing, that eventually the technology... Okay, this was back when I had this idea of doing like a HyperCard style game, right? Something where it's just screen-based, not scum, but basically, in some ways, I don't know at the time, but like thinking back, I'm thinking maybe it's almost kind of like Seventh Guest, where you've got like video intercut with kind of still frames and you're interacting on the still frame instead of walking characters around. But that eventually became, that technology eventually became Star Wars Encyclopedia, Insider's Guide, and Jar Jar's Journey.
So who's Chance Adams?
I had this idea. I wanted to do a game that was kind of retro. It was kind of retro futuristic, where in this world where almost like kind of like the 1950s view of the future, where nuclear power is cool and safe and it's going to save everybody.
No, in my recent conversation with Mike Levine, he shared with me some FMV footage that was filmed for Indiana Jones and the Iron Phoenix, which they eventually used for the technology they tested out at the time was eventually used for Rebel Assault 2. So let me share this unearthed footage that hasn't been seen in 30 years. So these are the scenes. See, this is Indie King Colette Michaud. Do you remember this actor? Were these filmed?
I don't actually remember this at all. What year was this?
Probably 1994, because Eric Wilmunder mentioned that this, or Mike Levine also mentioned that this technology was eventually used for Rebel Assault 2.
I don't really know what that's referring to, other than maybe just the fact that it's probably green screen, software green screening.
Mm-hmm.
Or I should say,
they didn't end up using it in the game. So.
Yeah, I think it's probably just, if using the term technology loosely, it's probably, I don't know how they did it, but whatever software process is used for green screen removal is probably, what they did to composite the scenes for Rebel Assault 2.
Still in 1996, you are credited as the project lead on the PlayStation version of Rebel Assault 2. Now, the PlayStation version saw the addition of 3D models and revamped user interfaces.
Yeah.
Why were these changes made instead of keeping the PlayStation version identical to the PC version?
The PlayStation version was something that was done out of house, but it was done for hardware differences. My understanding, it's like basically the PlayStation had its own hardware streaming system that could be used for the background, right? But it's got very different, like console hardware at the time is very different from PC hardware. PC hardware, you're dealing with pixels and stuff, and it's very general purpose. The console hardware tends to be very specific designed for very specific types of games, right? So like I kind of mentioned before about the Sega CD, how the Sega CD had hardware that was designed for tile-based games, and trying to do like a bitmap-based game through a tile-based system was really difficult to do, where we had to convert on the fly from pixels to tiles and then upload those tile definitions to video memory and then change the maps and stuff, when it's really designed for a sideways scroller like Mario, right? So PlayStation, I'm not that familiar with PlayStation hardware, but at the time, PlayStation had video hardware, so it was like, you could stream DVDs, so it had hardware to decompress videos. So it didn't really need any of my compression technology, so they could take the source videos and just, recompress those and play those. Now, Rebel Assault 2, I don't know if you noticed the difference between Rebel Assault 1 and Rebel Assault 2, but also depending on the speed of your machine, Rebel Assault 2 allowed different things to occur with the video. Like, normally the video is over-rendered, so it's actually larger than the screen, so it can pan around, right? So if you've got a faster machine, it can pan around and give you a little more. So you're not just playing a static screen. It feels like you're flying around a little bit more. And if you even have a faster machine, it'll actually shear to give you rotation. So when you tilt back and forth, it'll actually shear the background, so you can feel this horizon tilt as you move the joystick back and forth. That was kind of an aside, not really related to PlayStation, but PlayStation has video hardware. It's a little bit different. And then it's got your foreground layers and sprites, that you can use for cockpits and other stuff. So it was one of the things, it doesn't make sense. And in a lot of ways, it's probably not possible to port over Rebel Assault, the code as is. It was something that really had to take the assets and the design and kind of recode it to something that makes sense for the hardware.
So they had to recreate it from scratch either way, so they just revamped everything?
Yeah, they basically had to rebuild something that makes sense and that could work with the hardware. So they took the assets and the design, and then they were able to take things like the targeting data that I would set up in Smush that would set the rectangles for Smush, in addition to actually, having the audio and video, the actual gameplay things were also incorporated in Smush. In Smush, you could define a hit rectangle and then track it, and it would tween those hit rectangles from point to point. You would set that up in Smush, and that would determine, where your target moved and what counted as a hit and counted as a miss. So all that data was available too and could be translated over. I don't know how much of it they ended up using at the end, but I think it probably ended up being the beginning basis for what they had, because then they don't have to tune those portions. But the actual hardware, the actual software that actually renders the pieces and stuff is completely different from the PC.
Very well. Now, in 1996, still in 1996, you're also credited on the LucasArts Archives Volume 2 Star Wars collection. You got the additional programming credit. Now, usually they don't credit, for individual games in these collections. So presumably you had some additional programming done on this box set. Is it true?
I don't remember. I probably made special versions of, since they were cut down apps, like special versions of Rebel Assault with multiple. I made a bunch of different short versions with different levels included. So there's a little bit of programming involved in tying those together. I don't recall anything significant though, beyond
because
that.
in this specific collection, it's the full versions of Rebel Assault 1 and 2. So I know that for example, in the first collection, I think one of these games had the playable demo with the 3 levels. So that required additional programming. But over here, it's the full version. So
I wouldn't be surprised. And again, I don't remember. It's been so long. I wouldn't be surprised if I took things like Rebel Assault 1 and, updated the launcher and kind of the engine around it so that it could be playable on newer machines. Because I think it's like, it may not have been compatible just because it was written with the older versions of, it was written for an old version of DOS with the old DOS extension. So depending on what the target platform on this is post Rebel Assault 2. So it's probably something that they wanted to be compatible with Windows 95 as well, which I don't think the original Rebel Assault 2 was, or Rebel Assault 1 was.
It wasn't, because it was released in 1993. So they probably either you created the DOS launcher for Windows 95 for the game. Anyway, it was probably you worked for 10 minutes, got an additional credit. There you go. Now, in 1997, you were credited with insane video compression on Outlaws. Now, as we've discussed earlier, Full Throttle had several issues with using the Insane engine on its cartoon-style imagery. So for Outlaws, apparently you overcame all of these issues. Can you elaborate on the enhancements that you made to Insane for this game?
Yeah, I mean, in order to, kind of what I mentioned before about the kind of like the custom tile colors with the different special shapes, special shape tiles with customized colors that would occur in pairs that were meant to handle hard edges. That was something I specifically added for Outlaws to make it so that the compression would work better, because I knew that a cartoon style would require something that could keep the edges better than your normal video codec that was designed for live action.
And did you do any enhancements in order to handle the higher resolution?
Trying to think. The system was pretty generic, so I know that the higher resolution, Outlaws was higher resolution, of course, than later Mortimer was as well. But I think
Mortimer was before Outlaws.
Yeah, but I think that the system was generic, and there was always a version that could play at higher resolution, but it just would require higher throughput to play it. I don't recall the actual compression method itself was changed for higher resolution. It's not like I made the tiles any bigger or anything like that. It was still fundamentally the same. The major changes were just to make the animation support better.
That's interesting because, for example, in order to make SCUM compatible with the high resolution, they had to change everything. At the time, they added the high resolution at Humongous because that's where Brad Taylor and the team worked on the SCUM engine. And at LucasArts, the first SCUM game with high resolution was The Curse of Monkey Island, which we're going to talk about in a sec.
I wouldn't be surprised only in that you're talking about the SCUM engine probably being so old, probably had a lot of hard-coded references to like 320 by 200, 320, 240, I don't remember which was, at the time in the code base. Whereas I believe in Rebel Assault, especially since Rebel Assault 2 was rendering to an off-screen buffer anyway, so it wasn't hard-coded to a particular resolution. So it's basically a constant that could be changed in the code. Rebel Assault 1 was like more fixed, but Rebel Assault 2 was already like, I think it was something like 352 by something. I don't remember what the number was, but it was already not 320 by 200.
So you're saying that it's like an urban legend that you guys hard-coded resolutions into the SCUM system?
Well, I would ask, I don't know the specifics, but I would ask Eric about the resolution. I would be surprised if it was completely hard-coded, but there might be other limitations too, right? There might be something about the number of pixels, involved, or when you're dealing with certain data, you overflow, some kind of variable in size or something like that. That might have needed to be updated when you're going from low res to high res.
I presume that it's mainly revolves around the X and Y axis, because when you have high resolution, then things need to be aligned differently, not just at double the location. You don't take the X and Y axis, multiply it by 2, and get the new location in the high resolution. You have to handle it differently.
Yeah, and there might be things like, like there might be some places where they're storing the Y-axis, in some structure packed as a byte. And then when you want to go higher than, 255, then all of a sudden you need to change your data structures to be able to support that. And that sort of thing might have been there as well, but I don't know offhand. Eric might actually remember.
Very well. Time for another conversation with Eric Wilmunder. I'll clear up my schedule. Still in 1997, you're credited for the insane animation system on The Curse of Monkey Island. Now I understand that Eric Wilmunder took the insane engine and made Scum run on top of it, as opposed to having them run separately for gameplay and cutscenes. How was that integration achieved?
That was achieved by Eric. I think I was pretty hands-off. They gave me a credit only because they're using my code as per our prior, conversations on that kind of topic. But, it would have been impossible for me to be hands-on involved in all these projects over all these years, because I had my own things that I was working on. So, I think for a lot of it, my contribution is just to help out when somebody runs into a problem, explain things, or, to try to document my code.
In 1998, you were credited for the insane video compression on Grim Fandango. Now, I know that the Smush video player was used in Grim Fandango. Did you make any changes to it to make it compatible with the Grime engine?
Not that I can recall.
And where in the game was the insane video compression used?
In Grim Fandango?
Yeah.
I don't know. I imagine just in cutscenes, but I don't recall the actual specific instances.
Very well. Still in 1998, you received special thanks on Star Wars DroidWorks. How did you achieve this special thanks?
I don't remember. DroidWorks was Casey's project, was it?
Probably.
I don't remember. I have no idea.
Okay. In 1999, you were credited for the insane video compression in Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine. Now, as I recall, the game didn't have any cutscenes that didn't use the in-game 3D engine apart from the intro. Was there any other scene besides the intro where insane was used, to your knowledge?
I do not know. When was this?
1999.
1999. So that was my last year there. Mm-hmm. So I don't remember anything there.
Okay. So you missed Y2K at LucasArts.
I did. And I actually even missed episode 1. I think I left. No. I did. I stayed around for episode 1, I think. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. But it wasn't too much longer after that I left. Yep. I was maybe out mentally, at that point.
So when did you leave LucasArts, and what was the last project you worked on there?
The last project I worked on was the most ridiculous one. It was actually really fun, but it was ridiculous. And I'm only credited in the manual, and that is, I mentioned it earlier, it's Jar Jar's Journey adventure book.
Oh.
And it was an insane project because the entire project from start to finish, 5 months, which was unheard of. And I remember it was an idea that came from Mary Burr. She had this idea, that episode 1's coming out. She thought it would fit really good in the market to do like a children's product. And I had already built kind of like this page hypercard based system, which I'm really proud of. That nobody actually seems to know about this. I'll mention it here since maybe some programmers are listening. On all those products, Star Wars Encyclopedia, Insider's Guide, and Jar Jar's Journey, they're all built on the same engine. It's called the Behind the Magic engine, the BTM engine. If you have a file on your C drive called btmdev.tmp, btm_dev.tmp, it unlocks developer mode because the tool used to create the product is actually baked into the product itself. So if you have that file on your C drive, you can actually hit, I think it's escape or F1 and bring up the dev menu. And the game, I wrote a C language interpreter for those games. That's how I was able to do it so quickly, is that I could bring up the editor, type and change code, and then run it. And that code is like, so whenever you click on a button on anything on screen, it actually runs a script. And you can live edit those scripts. And that functionality is built into the actual game. So with that file, you can turn it on, view scripts, edit them, and actually change them and make them do different things.
Wow. So this will be the first thing I do after this conversation. Hopefully it works with emulators as well.
It should. It should. I think I tried it out. I tried it out a couple years ago, and it still works. So
it's supposed to be in the root, in the C drive root?
In the root of C drive, yeah.
Okay. I'm on it. So in November 1999, you founded Teal Point Software, where you served as the principal developer of mobile applications for the Palm OS, Windows Mobile, and Web OS.
Yes.
What can you share about your time at the company?
Oh, okay. So basically, Teal Point started like my last year at LucasArts. Like, it started as a side project where a friend of mine, I went out to sushi and he showed me his Palm Pilot, and I started playing around with it. It was like a primitive paint program on there that I thought was cool, but also kind of lacking. And the Palm Pilot itself at the time was pretty pricey. It was like $300, but I thought it was really cool. And I went out the next day and bought one. And I started just writing because I had experience writing VPaint. So, I'd written paint programs quite a number of times. So I started writing my very first version of Teal Paint in 68,000 assembly language for the Palm Pilot using a third-party, I forgot what it was called. There's an assembly language SDK for the Palm Pilot. And I just did it as a kind of just for fun in my spare time. And I put it out like a month later, in a software site called Palm Gear. And I put it up, along with two other little apps, Teal Magnify, I think, and Teal Glance. And I think I made $100 that first day. I made $100 the next day, and $100 the next day. And it was continuous. And then the market was growing. And so I realized it was like a real opportunity here. So I started like working in the evenings. Early in the morning, I'd wake up early and work. Then I'd go to LucasArts and put in a full day, sometimes longer in a full day, and then come home. And in evenings, I'd be up to like 3 a.m. doing Teal Point stuff. And so I started it as a side business, and it just took off. And I think my last year at LucasArts, I had my full salary put on tax withholding to pay for my taxes for Teal Point. And so like after a year, it was kind of like, it was time to leave. And it was probably the most difficult decision for me to make in my life at that point, because, I'd been there 8.5 years. It's kind of all I knew, but, all the arrows are pointing to the same direction. So I started doing Teal Point full time. And I said goodbye to LucasArts, and, the rest is history.
In June 2010, you started working as a software mobile engineer lead at TripIt, where you developed apps for iOS and Android.
Yeah. Basically what happened was kind of like, I like to tell people I was in mobile before there was mobile, right? So I was doing all the stuff for Palm Pilots, and later, Palm phones, and later Web OS, and I even did some apps for the Folio. Yeah, I don't know if you remember the Folio. Mm-hmm. Doing that side work, I came across like a friend who had an iOS app that needed help. And so I kind of started doing a little bit of iOS then. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I was, I learned on the go to kind of help out with this project. And so iOS eventually killed the Palm Pilot market. And it killed it for a number of reasons. Obviously it took all the customers too, but it also kind of changed an expectation for software. If you look at the App Store, when I was doing Palm Pilot stuff, we were selling software for $20 a pop. So if I could write an app in a couple weeks sell for $20 a pop. And in the end, I ended up having a lot of apps. They all added up to a really good business. But when Apple started first with their music store, started selling music for 99 cents, and then they decided to get into the app business, and they were kind of pressuring developers to kind of set the same kind of pricing, 99 cents for apps. It worked out great for Apple, but that expectation moving forward from that point is that, all of a sudden $20 is unheard of. $5 is an expensive app, right? And that's changed somewhat since those years, but not that much. And so it really kind of killed the mobile business as a software platform, as a software business for a lot of people. But I did learn how to do iOS. And so later, after Teal Point became something that was really no longer sustainable, I decided to go back into the job market, which led me to TripIt. They took a chance on me considering I'd been out of the job market for so long. So I went into iOS. And then from TripIt, I went to Twitter. And then to another company called School, which I was there for a year after we got musked. And now I'm at Netflix.
It's interesting because at TripIt you probably used Objective-C because Swift came out when you left TripIt.
Yes.
It came out in June 2014 and you left TripIt in June 2014.
Yeah, and so even at Twitter, the bulk of the code at Twitter was Objective-C, and I really wasn't doing Swift until kind of the end of the years of my time there. It became more and more popular.
Their apps have been Objective-C all these years? Wow.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of big companies have years and years of legacy Objective-C, so most companies are trying to move to Swift, but what do you do with all your old code? Do you devote resources to translate it over when those same resources can be used to create new features? That's always the dilemma.
As a side note, I have to say that as someone who's been on Twitter since 2009 and primarily used it on iOS devices, I've never used any third-party Twitter apps, just the official one. So you've been there 9 years, so most of my usage of the Twitter app was when you were there. So well done.
Yeah, Twitter at the time had a really good team of people. It was just a wonderful place to work. And, it was sad having to say goodbye to that, but, it's led to a lot of really cool possibilities.
And 6 months ago, you started working at Netflix as a level 5 software engineer.
Mm-hmm.
What can you share about your work at Netflix?
Since I am still there, I can't really share a whole lot other than basically, what is in my LinkedIn profile. So I work there. I'm working on a team called the Shared Client Foundation team. So I get to work on a lot of kind of infrastructure, sort of cross-platform based initiatives. And it's really awesome. We have obviously a very high quality, very well used app, even though mobile devices aren't the primary platform that people use Netflix on. They usually use their TVs, but still, it's a very cool app and a very, very important market and a neat user base.
First of all, I'm certain that Gen Z watches Netflix on their phones and not on a TV or even a computer screen like us boomers. But, I presume that there are enough users that use it on their mobile devices, whether iPad or phone. Now, the thing I like about Netflix is the fact that recently they entered the games industry. And on mobile, you also have games that you can play, like actual games. Recently, I played Grand Theft Auto Vice City on my mobile device because it was on Netflix. So this is pretty exciting. And another thing that excites me was the fact that back in 2018, they released that Black Mirror episode, the Bandersnatch episode, which was essentially an FMV game on your TV. And I understand that creating interactive content is much more expensive than just filming a standard TV show. But hopefully we'll get to see more engaging interactive content like that on Netflix. And hopefully they'll realize that you are the FMV god and they'll get you as the project lead on that project?
There are a lot of really smart people at Netflix. That's one of the great things I like about working for the company. So I think there's no real shortage of smarts to go around to handle the various parts of both the app and just the business in general. And that's one of the things I actually really like about the company. I'm still relatively new, a relative newbie, having started just earlier this year, but it's been a really cool experience.
When the stars will align and Rebel Assault will be on Netflix, like in the game section, then I'll know that there's still hope in the world.
That would be interesting. Yeah, and it's funny when I still see that. Like, I think when you can get Rebel Assault on Steam and see it, I'm just surprised that you can still see it around after all these years. But I've had a chance to kind of play it recently, in a DOS box on my Mac, and even in Windows XP as well, and it brings back a lot of memories. I'm surprised at how parts of it kind of hold up. Parts of it are very hokey, but other parts of it, it's like, oh wow, this isn't completely ridiculous even today.
Nah, it's still great. Come on, each and every part of it is great. The first game is great, apart from Beggar's Canyon, and the second game, just like I said, is my favorite Star Wars game. Still is, and so nothing will take that away. Now, the thing is that, with these games, for example, when I play GTA 3 on Netflix, get a little joystick at the bottom right corner to use as a joystick for the game, because the game itself was created for PC and for console. They don't have any mobile controls for it. So they just add a joystick. So they can do the same thing for Rebel Assault. Run it in an emulator, then add controls on top of it, and that's it. And again, it can be any worse than using your mouse to pass Beggar's Canyon in the first game.
Or keyboard.
Or keyboard. I'm certain that there's no keyboard support. Or else I've bought a joystick for nothing because I couldn't play it with my mouse back in the day.
But I'm pretty sure it works. I can't guarantee it's fun.
You know what? I have the manual over here, so I'll let you know. I think... No.
I mean, I had a habit of just kind of if it was possible, I would try to stick it in. So I believe it's there.
Okay, so even in the manual, it says, joystick movement and mouse movement. It doesn't have any keyboard movement. So this is false advertising, because on the box itself, it says you need a keyboard. You probably need the keyboard because it was on DOS, so you had to type the commands to run the game. But other than that, the keyboard has no actual use in the game itself. Now, before we conclude our conversation, I have one final question. What are your plans for 2025, and how can people stay in touch with you and your work?
Oh, let's see. I think plans in regards to I don't know if I have anything.
Rebel Assault 3.
Rebel Assault 3. No plans for Rebel Assault 3. I am talking about possibly doing a panel at some convention in the spring just for the anniversary of Rebel Assault 2. But that's still in the works, so that might actually happen.
Wow, this is exciting. So once you have details about this convention and about your talks, send them over, and I'll be sure to advertise it on our social channels.
It'll give me a chance to actually wear my, Rebel Assault 2 leather jacket, which, I have had no occasion to wear, even though I try to find occasions on Star Wars Day or something, but I haven't had the guts to actually wear it outside anywhere.
Is this the leather jacket they made you buy through the adventure at a discount price?
No. I actually went out to a manufacturer that actually makes varsity jackets, makes custom ones, and sent them the image and paid to have a logo embroidery done for this the Rebel Assault logo. And then I made jackets for myself and the team. So mine's all leather. The other team ones, I think, have leather sleeves and then like a wool body.
Wow. Probably looks badass, but you know what would be more badass? If you'd come to the convention with the green costume you wore in that ending scene in Rebel Assault 2.
Yeah, I'll have to talk to Amy about that. She's still the costumer at Lucas who's still there. But I don't think there's a very high chance that happened.
Too bad. Well, Vince, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today. And thank you for all of your contributions to the video game industry.
Sure. Thank you for like bringing up a lot of good memories and saying some nice things about me. And, I want to wish you the best luck and, hope you continue this journey of like, contacting and all the other people that I miss very dearly after all these years. And I hope they're all doing well as well.